When we look at what actually is changing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's things like, engineers coming up with better, cheaper solar panels. It's things like the war in Ukraine, putting up the cost of fossil fuels. Those are the things that really seem to change politicians' minds, perhaps not this.
So I don't think you're advocating for war, right?
The point I am making is that it's big things away from here which seem to be really making the difference.
Well, of course, because engineers you don't negotiate the design of solar panels, right? But what you do negotiate is the headline targets, so net zero in Paris, and then really tightened up as to 1.5 degrees in Glasgow. Why was it tightened up? Because Paris asked the scientists to come back and say, what's the difference between 1.5 and 2? Difference is 1.5 is bad, 2 is terrible. And then that ratchet mechanism which Paris set in motion has started so that the Paris goals start getting translated into national goals. But then what we start to see happening is, what I'm responsible for working with is all those non-state actors. So you get cities like London and Paris having low emission zones. And then you get car manufacturers saying, you know what, we're going to go net zero by 2039. That then emboldens countries to be more, so it's everybody's feeding back off everybody else.
So in effect what you're saying is there's a sort of string or maybe elastic that goes from what happens here to companies or cities or inventors and kind of pulls them in the right direction?
Yes, and what we're seeing is that all converges towards what are we got to do to get to net zero as quickly as possible. So one thing that's been triggered by this process is very clear sense of what the pathway to zero is in every sector. And then in Glasgow, we landed that as the breakthrough agenda. So what do we have to do to get to net zero steel? 170 million tons of green steel plants built by 2030. What have we got to do to end the combustion engine? 60% EV sales by 2030. What do we see here in Sharm el-Sheikh? 60 million tons of those green steel plants are now in the pipeline. And we've had growing agreement that we're going to end combustion engine sales globally for cars in 2035 and trucks in 2040.
And I met someone from the building sector who was quite excited about what's happened there. Tell me.
Yeah, so again, built environment huge. 40% of emissions come from buildings, in building them and operating them. And now we've included the breakthrough on buildings in this breakthrough agenda with Morocco and France leading on that, and then the World Green Building Council and many businesses all getting behind those same short-term goals. Reducing emissions massively by 2030, zero carbon operations, and at least 40% reduction in the material content of the carbon.
Yeah, so it really will change the way buildings are built and operated to make them more climate friendly. What happened here?
What happened here as a forcing mechanism and a convening point, and it will have to be translated then into company investment plans, company R&D plans, city building regulations, government procurement regulations. So you can't solve the problem here, but you can send the signals by convening around the headline target, which then get implemented everywhere else.
Are COPs a lot of talk that provides a critical foundation for action, or are they a mask for inaction?
Look, it's a very complicated process trying to get 190 plus countries to agree on anything. So there's often an element of lowest common denominator around what is effectively a single party veto. So I think the accusation of a mask for inaction is sometimes valid when people are deliberately trying to slow things down. But by far and away what they are is a creation of a framework for action, which then requires other processes to fill in. But that then feeds back, right? Because the more you see momentum from the real world, the more it emboldens negotiators to do their job and set higher and faster targets. And that's what we're seeing here. It's a huge risk, it's a huge mistake to think that the only measure of success is the negotiated text. It's also a huge mistake to dismiss the negotiations as not being relevant anymore.